Why would a woman who claims she doesn't love her husband still expect him to stay loyal? What happens when the man everyone pities quietly turns the tables with nothing but patience, proof, and the law on his side? My name is Mirielle Hart. I'm 34, and I used to tell people marriage was supposed to feel like safety. For a while, it did. Caleb and I built our lives one quiet year at a time. Steady jobs, a small house, an 8-year-old daughter who still sleeps with her stuffed rabbit. From the outside, we looked fine, maybe too fine. The kind of couple people stop asking about because they assume you're unshakable. But inside, I felt like I was disappearing. Caleb wasn't cruel or careless. He was just dull, predictable. He worked, came home, paid bills, and smiled politely when I complained. It was like being married to silence. I told myself it wasn't my fault for wanting more. I was only trying to feel alive again. That's what I said when I joined the gym, when I started posting more pictures of myself, when I stayed out late claiming I had work dinners. I thought he'd notice, maybe even fight for me. Instead, he stayed calm. Too calm. One night I said I didn't love him anymore, expecting tears or anger, some proof that I still mattered. He just looked at me and said he understood. I remember feeling insulted. Who just accepts that? I told myself he must not have loved me in the first place. That's when I met Evan, young, energetic, and always saying the right things. He told me I deserved attention, that I was too interesting to be trapped in a quiet marriage. I didn't plan anything. It just happened, the way things do when you want to be wanted. I convinced myself it wasn't real cheating if it was emotional. I still came home every night, still made breakfast for my daughter, still slept beside my husband. I told myself I was loyal in every way that counted. Looking back now, I can see how ridiculous that sounds. But at the time, I believed it. I believed I could claim indifference and still expect devotion, that I could break something and demand it stay whole. Caleb didn't fight back, didn't shout, didn't throw me out. He just started writing things down, saving receipts, staying later at work. I thought it meant he was avoiding me. I didn't realize he was building a case. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. It happened on a Sunday evening, right after dinner. Caleb was rinsing plates, quiet as usual, while Tessa hummed in the living room. I was scrolling through my phone, pretending to check emails. But really, I was staring at a message from Evan. He'd written that I looked radiant even when I was tired. I smiled at the screen longer than I should have. Caleb asked if something was funny, and I said no. Then, out of nowhere, I heard myself say it, that I didn't love him anymore. He didn't even drop the plate in his hand. He just looked at me for a few seconds, nodded once, and said he'd figured. That was it. No panic, no argument, no, we can fix this. He just turned off the tap and started wiping the counter like I hadn't just ended something sacred. I felt heat rush to my face, part embarrassment, part anger. I had wanted a reaction, not resignation. I told him I wasn't saying I wanted a divorce, just that I felt disconnected. He said we didn't have to talk about it if I didn't want to. That made it worse. I went upstairs furious, convinced he was punishing me with calmness. He'd always been like that, steady, logical, emotionless. I used to find it grounding. Now it felt like cruelty disguised as peace. The next morning, I started my new gym membership. I told Caleb it was for my mental health. He said he was glad I was doing something for myself. I rolled my eyes behind his back because I knew that meant he didn't care enough to ask more. At the gym, everything felt new and easy. Evan was the trainer assigned to my program. He was a few years younger, funny, and effortlessly confident. The kind of man who looks right into your eyes when he talks and never seems in a hurry to leave. When I mentioned I had a daughter, he said I didn't look like a mom at all. I laughed, and for the first time in months, I felt noticed. I came home late that night and told Caleb there'd been a long class. He nodded, said he'd reheated dinner for me. No questions, no accusations. I almost wanted him to ask where I'd really been. I told myself I was testing him, giving him a chance to fight for me. When he didn't, I decided his silence was permission. Over the next few weeks, I started staying out later, saying I was meeting coworkers or doing overtime. I wasn't doing anything serious yet, just staying after workouts, talking to Evan about life, laughing too hard at his jokes. It felt like harmless friendship, the kind that filled the quiet spaces Caleb had left behind. One night, when I came home around 11, Caleb was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open. He asked if I'd eaten. I said I had. Then he asked, very calmly, who I'd been with. I said co-workers, and before he could reply, I accused him of being suspicious. He said he wasn't suspicious, just curious. I told him that was worse, that it meant he didn't trust me. He said he did. That confused me even more. I stormed upstairs, muttering that he was impossible to talk to. Behind me, he said, "You keep saying you don't love me, Mirielle, but you still expect me to act like nothing changed." I didn't answer. I didn't like how true it sounded. The next day, I called my mother. She told me I was just bored, and that Caleb was a safe man, the kind women regret leaving. I said I didn't want safety. I wanted passion. She laughed softly and said, "Passion fades, but stability keeps the lights on." I hung up annoyed. That weekend, Caleb found a dinner receipt in my bag. It wasn't mine. Evan had paid for it, but I'd taken it absent-mindedly. Caleb asked where I'd been that night. I said I'd been at a work meeting. He didn't say anything else, just nodded again, folded the receipt, and walked away. I told myself he was playing mind games, trying to guilt me with silence. I told Evan about it the next day at the gym. He laughed and said my husband sounded like a calm volcano. I laughed too, pretending that idea didn't scare me. Still, that night, when I came home and saw Caleb asleep on the couch, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Not between us, but around us. Like he was already thinking 2 steps ahead, while I was still telling myself everything was under control. People always told me Caleb was lucky, that he'd married up, that I was the spark to his stillness. I loved that narrative. I repeated it to myself whenever guilt tried to crawl in. A few weeks after the receipt incident, my friends and I met for dinner. I told them Caleb had grown distant, that he barely touched me, barely spoke. They all said he sounded depressed, maybe overworked. I shrugged and said he'd been that way for years. Someone asked if I'd ever thought of leaving. I said I didn't want to be cruel, I just wanted him to change. One of them joked that I needed someone who could keep up with me. I laughed and said, "Well, not everyone can handle me." Evan texted during dinner, "You looked incredible today. I can't stop thinking about you." I smiled into my glass of wine. When I got home that night, Caleb was still awake, reading in bed. He asked if I'd had fun. I said yes. Then he asked if Evan was there. I froze. I told him not to start rumors. He said he'd never mentioned any. I accused him of stalking me, of trying to control me, of turning into some paranoid husband. He looked hurt, genuinely hurt, but I was too caught up in defending myself to care. I went to sleep angry, pretending I was the one being wronged. The next morning, I found him at the kitchen table with a notebook and his laptop. He said he was organizing our finances. I asked if he was expecting a divorce. He said calmly that he was preparing for all possibilities. I called him cold and heartless. He said he was just being practical. At work, I couldn't stop replaying that word. Practical. He was always so rational even now as our marriage cracked. I told myself that made him less human. That's what I needed to believe to keep doing what I was doing. My mother came over later that week and told me Diane, my mother-in-law, had called her. Apparently, Caleb had mentioned we were working through things. Ruth said I should be careful not to make Caleb look foolish in front of his family. I said he was doing that all on his own. That weekend, We had a small barbecue with neighbors. Caleb grilled quietly while I played hostess, laughing too loud, drinking too much wine. Someone asked jokingly how we'd managed 8 years of marriage without killing each other. I said Caleb was loyal like a dog, quiet, obedient, and always there when you need him. The table erupted with laughter. I looked over at him, expecting a smirk, but he didn't even glance my way. He just flipped the burgers, face unreadable. Later that night, after everyone left, I found him outside cleaning the grill. I said he was overreacting, that it had been a joke. He said he knew it was, and that's what made it worse. I told him he was being dramatic. He said, "Maybe not forever." That sentence stuck in my head for days. Maybe not forever. I told Evan about it at the gym. He said Caleb was bluffing. "Guys like that never leave," he said. "They cling harder when they think they're losing you." I wanted to believe him. But something in Caleb's tone that night hadn't sounded like bluffing. It had sounded like a decision. 2 weeks later, I found out he'd stopped using our joint credit card. When I asked why, he said he'd separated our accounts for convenience. I said that was suspicious. He said it was responsible. I started to feel cornered. I tried to pull him back in emotionally, asking him one night if he still loved me. He said love wasn't the problem, respect was. I told him he was punishing me for being honest. He said honesty without loyalty isn't virtue, it's cruelty. That line infuriated me. I told myself he was twisting things to make himself the victim. That's what men like him did. Quietly make you look like the bad guy while pretending to take the high road. But then the whispers started. One of the neighbors told me Caleb had been meeting with a lawyer. Another said he'd seen him at the bank with a folder full of documents. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He said he was sorting out future logistics. I shouted that he was trying to make me look like an adulteress when I hadn't done anything serious. He just said, "Not yet." I told him he was cruel. He said, "I'm prepared." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house felt heavy. I checked on Tessa, asleep with her stuffed rabbit, and wondered if she'd notice if things fell apart. When I went downstairs for water, Caleb's phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with a reminder. Meeting with family law. Thursday, 9:30 a.m. I stared at it for a long time. Then I deleted the notification and went back upstairs, pretending it didn't mean anything. But it did. I could feel it in the way he started smiling politely again, like a man who'd already made peace with losing something. Like he'd accepted the storm and started building his shelter before I even realized it was raining. After that, everything turned quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. Caleb stopped trying to talk about anything personal, and I convinced myself I was fine with that. I told people we were just in a weird stage, that couples go through phases. But deep down, I could feel something slipping away, something I didn't think he'd ever have the courage to let go of. I kept telling myself I had the upper hand. He still wore his wedding ring, still came home every night, still cooked for Tessa, and helped with her schoolwork. I told myself that meant he'd never really leave. But the calm he carried now wasn't obedience. It was distance. He had turned quiet into armor, and I didn't know how to break through it anymore. Meanwhile, things with Evan started feeling less like a harmless distraction and more like a dangerous game. He texted constantly, little compliments, jokes about how married life must be dull. I told him he didn't understand, that Caleb and I barely spoke. He said that sounded lonely, that I deserved someone who noticed me. I didn't realize I was repeating the same lines I'd used to justify everything else. One evening, Caleb asked if I could send him a copy of the gym's payment schedule since he was reorganizing the budget. I froze for a second before saying I'd look for it later. He nodded and said, "Take your time." The next day, I noticed he'd gone through the kitchen drawer where I kept old receipts. I confronted him, accused him of spying again. He said calmly that transparency was part of marriage. I told him that was funny coming from someone who was secretly talking to lawyers. He didn't rise to it. He just said, "You think I'm the problem because I'm quiet, but silence isn't guilt, Mirielle. It's patience." That line stuck with me, and I hated that it did. At the gym, Evan asked if Caleb knew about us. I told him there was no us, that we were just talking. He laughed and said I sounded like someone lying to herself. That stung more than it should have. Later, he sent a message saying we should slow down before people start talking. I asked if he was worried about his reputation, and he said it wasn't that. He just didn't want trouble at work. I realized then that I'd never been anything more than entertainment for him. When I got home that night, Caleb was at his desk again, typing something. I asked what he was working on, and he said it was documentation. I asked, "For what?" He said, "For the truth." I went to bed without another word, but I couldn't sleep. His calmness had shifted again. It wasn't exhaustion anymore. It was control. I had spent months convincing myself I was the one with power, but somehow he'd taken it back without even raising his voice. A few days later, he invited me to dinner, said we needed to talk about logistics. I thought maybe he was finally ready to discuss fixing things, or ending them on my terms. When I arrived at the restaurant, he wasn't there. Instead, I got a text saying he was running late and to wait at the table. 15 minutes later, a man in a suit walked up and introduced himself as Caleb's lawyer. I laughed because I thought it was a joke. Then he handed me a folder and said Caleb wanted me to review some documents before mediation. I told him I had no idea what he was talking about. The lawyer just smiled politely and said Caleb would explain. When I got home, Caleb was sitting in the living room with a cup of tea. I threw the folder on the table and demanded to know what it was. He said it was a preliminary separation review. I told him he had no right to make plans without me. He said I'd made plenty of plans without him. I accused him of being cruel, manipulative, vindictive. He said, "No, just prepared." I shouted that he was acting like I'd destroyed our family. He said quietly, "You did. You just don't know it yet." That night, I tore up the papers and threw them in the trash. But the next morning, there was a new copy waiting on the counter. He didn't say a word about it. He just handed Tessa her backpack and kissed her forehead before leaving for work. That's when it hit me. He wasn't warning me anymore. He was done warning me. I tried to regain control, but nothing worked. Every time I pushed, he stayed calm. Every time I accused, he agreed. It was like arguing with a wall that refused to crumble. I told my mother he was making me crazy with his quiet revenge. She said maybe I should just apologize. I told her it wasn't about guilt. It was about respect. She said I should think about why I felt the need to defend myself so hard. I hung up before she could say more. At work, I couldn't focus. I kept checking my phone, half expecting Caleb to send some ultimatum, half terrified he actually would. Instead, I got a message from Evan. "We need to stop texting for a while. People are starting to notice." I asked what that meant, but he didn't reply. That afternoon, I saw him talking to another woman at the gym. She laughed, touching his arm the way I used to. I wanted to believe it didn't bother me, but it did. I had risked everything for someone who was already moving on. When I came home that evening, Caleb was cooking dinner for Tessa. He asked if I was joining them. I said I wasn't hungry. He shrugged and said, "Suit yourself." Later that night, I checked his laptop. I knew his password. He'd never changed it. I found folders labeled Finances, Custody, and Timeline. Inside were screenshots of text messages, my credit card statements, photos of receipts, even a copy of the gym membership contract. I felt my stomach drop. When I confronted him, he didn't deny any of it. He just said he needed proof of what had been happening in case things got messy. I told him he was destroying us. He said, "You did that the day you stopped pretending you cared." I slapped the laptop shut and said he had no right to use my private life against me. He said, "It's not private when you use our money to pay for it." I hated him then. not for what he was doing, but for being so calm while doing it. The next week, things escalated quietly. Tessa mentioned that Daddy had a new apartment, just in case Mommy needed more space. I nearly dropped my coffee. When I asked Caleb about it, he said it was temporary, just for convenience during the separation process. I told him he couldn't take our daughter anywhere without my permission. He said he'd already spoken to a lawyer about shared custody. That night, I packed a small bag, planning to stay at my mother's for a few days. When I told him, he nodded and said he'd expected that. As I walked out, he said, "Just remember, Mirielle, peace is a choice." I didn't respond. At my mother's house, Ruth listened to my story and said Caleb was being strategic, not cruel. "He's not punishing you," she said. "He's protecting himself." I told her she didn't understand, that he was turning everyone against me. She sighed and said softly, "Maybe you did that yourself." I wanted to scream, but instead I went upstairs and stared at my reflection. I looked tired, older, like someone I didn't recognize. The next morning, I got an email from Caleb's lawyer requesting I attend a formal mediation session to establish terms of separation and custody. It included attachments, documents I recognized from his laptop, evidence. That same day, I went to the gym, needing to see Evan, to at least feel like someone was still on my side. When I walked in, he was at the counter talking to another trainer. He looked startled when he saw me. I asked if we could talk. He said quietly that it wasn't a good time. I asked if he was avoiding me. He said he just wanted to keep things professional. That was the final crack. The thing I'd risked everything for was already gone, and the man I'd taken for granted was preparing to end the story his way. When I returned home to pick up a few things, the house was half empty. His clothes, his laptop, even his framed photos were gone. Tessa's backpack was missing too. On the kitchen table was a sealed envelope with my name on it. Inside was a note written in his neat, steady handwriting. "For custody arrangements. I'll be civil if you are." I read it twice, trying to find hidden anger in the words. There wasn't any, just finality. I called him over and over, but he didn't answer. I texted him, "You can't just take her." He replied, "I didn't take her. I protected her." That night I sat in the empty house, surrounded by silence I had once accused him of. It was different now, sharper, heavier. The kind of silence that means something has ended, and there's no undoing it. I used to think I was the one pulling the strings, controlling the story. But the truth was simpler and colder. He'd been writing everything down while I was still talking. And now he had proof of everything I'd said, everything I'd done, everything I'd become. The morning of the mediation, I sat in my car outside the law office, gripping the steering wheel until my fingers hurt. I kept telling myself I could still fix it, that if I stayed calm and looked sincere, Caleb would soften. He wasn't cruel, I reminded myself, just methodical. I could reach him if I showed a little humility. That was the plan. Inside, the office smelled like paper and lemon polish. The mediator's assistant smiled politely as she led me into the room. Caleb was already there, of course. Neatly dressed, posture straight, his files stacked perfectly in front of him. He didn't even look at me. The mediator, a woman with a low voice and kind eyes, started by asking if we both understood the purpose of the meeting. Caleb nodded. I hesitated, then nodded too. His lawyer began with what he called an overview of the arrangement. The words sounded clinical: property division, shared custody, financial adjustments. I didn't hear much after shared custody. The lawyer explained that Caleb was seeking primary residence for Tessa, citing emotional stability concerns. I cut him off. "Are you implying I'm unstable?" Caleb spoke for the first time. "I'm saying you're distracted." I laughed, sharp and shaky. "So now working out and trying to have a life makes me unfit?" He said, "Neglecting your family and lying about it does." The mediator asked us to stay respectful. I wanted to scream. Then Caleb slid a folder across the table. Inside were printouts of text messages, Evan's messages, my replies, dates, times. He'd even printed screenshots from social media where people had commented on how free I looked lately. I pushed the folder back toward him. "You've been spying on me," he said. "I've been paying attention." I looked at the mediator, desperate for sympathy. "This isn't about love, it's about control." Caleb's lawyer interjected calmly, "Actually, Mrs. Hart, this is about documentation." It felt like being stabbed with politeness. The mediator asked if I wanted to respond to the evidence. I said it was taken out of context, that Evan and I were just friends, that I'd been lonely, that Caleb had pushed me away. I used every word I could think of to sound reasonable. Caleb didn't interrupt. He just listened, hands folded, like a man hearing an obituary he'd already written. When I finished, he said, "You claimed you didn't love me, Mirielle. I accepted that. But you kept expecting me to act like I did something wrong for believing you." I tried to meet his eyes, but I couldn't. The mediator said we could take a break. I went to the restroom, locked the door, and stared at myself in the mirror. My face looked strange, pale, drawn. I kept thinking about the way he'd said my name, without anger, without tenderness, just final. When I went back, they were already reviewing the financial documents. The lawyer explained how Caleb had separated our accounts, ensured the mortgage payments were in his name, and filed to freeze joint credit. "Standard protective measures," he said, as if I were some risk to be managed. I told Caleb this was revenge. He said, "No, this is what happens when you keep calling cruelty honesty." The mediator asked if there was anything either of us wanted to say before signing. Caleb shook his head. I forced a small laugh and said, "You'll regret this. Tessa will hate you when she's old enough to understand." He looked right at me. "She already understands. You taught her what betrayal looks like. I'm just showing her what consequences do." He signed the papers with slow, deliberate strokes. When he was done, he stood and said quietly to the mediator, "Thank you for your time." Then he left. I sat there, pretending to review the documents, but all I could see was his signature, clean, firm, absolute. That night, I called him. He didn't answer. I texted, "We could still try counseling. For Tessa." He replied 2 minutes later, "Counseling doesn't work when only one person tells the truth." I dropped the phone and stared at the ceiling, realizing that for the first time since we'd met, I had no idea what he was thinking, or what he'd do next. Weeks passed. The house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a waiting room for bad news. Tessa spent most of her time with Caleb now. On the days she came to me, she was polite, but distant, like she'd already learned silence from him. I tried to stay busy. I went to work, went to the gym, avoided everyone's eyes. Even Evan stopped coming around. He transferred to another branch, sent one last message saying he hoped things worked out. I didn't reply. The mediation terms became final sooner than I expected. The lawyer called to confirm that the custody and property agreements were approved by the court. My car was now officially mine, one of the few things I got to keep. The house, however, went to Caleb. I had 60 days to move out. I told myself it didn't matter, that I'd start fresh, that maybe this was what freedom looked like. But every time I packed a box, I caught sight of some tiny thing. A family photo, Tessa's old drawing, Caleb's coffee mug, and felt something sharp twist in my chest. The next Friday, I went to Tessa's school to drop off her lunchbox. Caleb was already there, waiting by the gates. He was talking to her teacher, smiling, looking so calm it made me furious. When he saw me, he nodded politely. I said we needed to talk. He said we didn't. I told him we couldn't keep doing this, that she needed both of us. He said she had both of us, just not under the same roof. I said, "You're punishing me." He said, "I'm protecting her." I took a deep breath and said I was sorry. Not because I meant it, but because I thought it might change something. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "Apologies mean something when they stop coming with conditions." Then the bell rang. Tessa came running, her backpack bouncing. She hugged him first. Then she turned to me and hugged me too, but it was quick, distracted. She said Daddy was taking her to her friend's house for the weekend. I nodded and tried to smile. When they drove away, I stood there in the parking lot until everyone else was gone. The teacher gave me a sympathetic look as she locked the gate. I didn't need sympathy. I needed to rewind time. Later that evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, scrolling through old photos, vacations, birthdays, the small life I'd spent years mocking. I thought about the night I told him I didn't love him. I had wanted power. All I'd done was give it away. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. It was an email notification. Final confirmation, court approval granted. I opened it. Attached were scanned copies of the signed agreement and the finalized custody order. At the bottom of the document was a note from his lawyer. Mr. Hart requests minimal contact except regarding the child. I stared at that line until my vision blurred. Minimal contact. After a decade together, that's all I was worth now, a line in a legal document. I sent him one last text. "You win. I hope you're happy." He replied a few minutes later, "Happiness isn't the goal, Mirielle. Peace is." That was the last message I ever got from him. When I finally moved out, the house was spotless. I'd scrubbed every surface, packed every memory into boxes I didn't even want. Before I left, I stood in the living room and whispered to no one, I didn't mean to lose everything. But maybe I had. Outside, the sky was gray. It started to drizzle as I loaded the last box into my car. The rain streaked the windshield as I drove away. At a red light, I looked at my phone. The wallpaper was still a photo of Caleb and Tessa on the beach last summer. They looked happy, unguarded before everything fractured. For a second, I almost smiled. Then I changed the background to black. That night, I checked my email again, half hoping for some follow-up, some loophole that would let me undo what I'd done. There was nothing new, just the final notice sitting there like a verdict. I thought about calling him, about asking if he really believed peace was worth so much silence. But I knew what he'd say. Nothing. He'd just stay quiet, like always, and let the silence answer for him. So I didn't call. I just closed my laptop, turned off the light, and sat alone in the dark apartment. Somewhere across town, he was probably reading Tessa a bedtime story, his voice calm and steady, the way it always was. And for the first time, I finally understood that the quiet I used to resent was the same quiet he used to survive me. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.